So on March 13th, 1964, she was closing down the bar and she leaves at about 2:30 in the morning. While she's driving home, there was a man that spotted her. He just pulled up next to her and he sees her and he decides to follow her home. It is the story of Kitty Genovese. Kitty was someone in the 1950s who she worked a couple of clerical jobs. She lived in New York around the Brooklyn area with her family. And ironically, her mother actually wanted to move away to Connecticut because a murder had happened in the area that made her really, really uncomfortable. So her family kind of starts planning to get out of town. But at the time, Kitty ends up getting married to a guy. This relationship kind of dissolves pretty quickly. She's out of it. And she's kind of floating through life, trying to figure things out. She works a couple clerical jobs. She doesn't like it. And then she becomes a bartender and she likes it. But then also, Kitty starts dating a woman. The woman ends up moving in with her and they're in a relationship, which this is crazy for the 1950s. But Kitty said, nah, this is what's going down. So she's in this relationship. As far as reports say, they're happy, things are good. But unfortunately, that relationship would not last that long. Kitty worked double shifts at a restaurant. She would bartend, she would waitress, and on this night, she was closing down the bar and she leaves at about 2:30 in the morning. While she's driving home, there was a man that spotted her. He just pulled up next to her and he sees her and he decides to follow her home. So on March 13th, 1964, she drives home. It takes her about 30 minutes to get home. He said she had a little red Fiat back in 64. She gets to her house, her apartment complex. She parks her car about 100 feet away from the door. And as she gets out of the car and she starts walking towards the door, she turns around and she sees a man walking towards her with a large hunting knife. So Kitty gets scared. It's 2:30 in the morning. She's the only person in this parking lot and she starts to run away from the man. And he runs after her and he catches up to her, and with this incredibly large knife, he stabs her twice in the back. Kitty calls out. She starts screaming. And this was really interesting. She screamed, and a neighbor, his name was Robert Moser, he just opened his window and he yells, "Leave that girl alone." Not knowing she'd been stabbed, but knows that something's going on and this woman's distressed. So the guy gets scared and he runs off. So Kitty, by herself with nobody around, starts to crawl to her apartment door, like it's just right there. But there was some type of door or gate or something that led into it, which she could not open. The door was locked. And so now she's in a hallway. And this knife was so large that she has been brutally stabbed and she's bleeding profusely. And then somebody appears in the corridor, and this guy, it's a different, like he's wearing a wide brimmed hat. And so this man walks up, and then Kitty looks up and realizes that it's the same man that stabbed her, and he's back. He begins to stab her again multiple times, tens of times, and like I said before, guys, this was a huge knife. He is cutting up her hands. He's cutting through organs. He is just shredding her while she is screaming and crying for help. And people heard this in the apartment complex and nobody did anything. And we're going to get to a breakdown video of why. But this man continues to stab her, and she had lots of defensive wounds on her hands. Later, it was found that her attacker had wounds on his hands as well. That's how crazy this fight was. And when he had subdued her enough, trigger warning, he raped her. And I'm not censoring that because this happened and it's important, okay? So after he does this, he basically stabs her almost to death. She is just barely hanging on to life. And he also steals $49 from her. After that, he leaves. He gets away in his car, and Kitty lays there bleeding out. Barely has the energy to call for help anymore, can't really do anything, and probably is starting to feel like she's giving up. But at one point after, this was around 4 a.m., like 10, 15 minutes after the attack, a woman named Sophia Ferrar comes up and she sees that Kitty is dying. And she basically holds Kitty in her arms and, just kind of like rocks her because maybe she just doesn't know what to do. After this happened, this becomes a very, very popular case because of the way that the media portrayed it. They had a really interesting headline on this. When all the witnesses were interviewed, they were like, why didn't anyone do anything? The police do get called and they get there and an ambulance gets there. Unfortunately, Kitty was alive when she got into the ambulance, but she died from her injuries on the way to the hospital. So the police started interrogating everyone and they're like, what the fuck? And in the initial police report, it said that 38 people were interviewed. So the New York Times, or a writer for the New York Times, picks this up and he puts out this explosive article that basically says 38 people witness woman stabbed to death. Nobody does anything. And it created this major outrage. It created this criticism of the people involved. It created just a lot of questions, but also, to be fair, it blew the case out of proportion because a lot of the things in there were not actually facts. But that article, I think, is part of the reason why we had a national push for the 911 call, but we'll get there. This is Winston Moseley. To some people, they might have thought that this was a pretty normal guy because he had a wife and he had 3 kids. And back in the day, that's all you needed for people to think that you were a functioning member of society. A couple days later after the murder, 6 days later, he gets caught on a completely unrelated burglary. And when the police start to interrogate him, they realize he's got all these cuts and whatnot on his hands too. And somehow they connect it to Kitty and they start asking him questions. And then he admits to the murder. He also confesses to over 40 burglaries in the area, 2 other murders, and sexual assaults. They promptly arrest him and they set up his court date. Psychologists basically said that he showed signs of being a necrophiliac. That's what they said, which is possibly true. But also, as we go through this, you're going to see that this guy really liked to say things for shock value. And on top of that, he was trying to get away with an insanity plea. So that's kind of a factor in it. But when he goes to trial, they just kind of throw out the insanity plea and they try this guy like normal. And at the end of it, the jury comes back and they say death penalty. The judge actually even said during the court case, during the sentencing, he said he didn't believe in the death penalty. But when he sees a monster like Winston, he says he would pull the switch himself after they went through all the facts in the case for the jury, because Winston liked to talk. I think he liked to brag about the things that he did. So after this, Moseley is sentenced to death. But shortly after, that gets revoked because there's some kind of error where they said they didn't consider the insanity plea. So it gets reduced to life. But this piece of shit is not done yet. One day, he comes up with an idea because he doesn't want to be in jail anymore. He's been there for a while, and I guess he just decides that he's over it. He fakes an illness and ends up having to go to the hospital for some kind of minor surgery. On the way back, he convinces the medical help that he shouldn't be shackled up because he's still in pain. So they don't shackle his feet. They don't handcuff him to anything. And he's on the bus by himself with the security person. So Winston knocks the guy out and runs off the bus and flees. And he makes it to a house that's literally only 2,000 feet away from the hospital, okay? 2,000 feet away. That's how close he was. And he stumbles on an empty house. And unfortunately, this empty, unoccupied house happens to have a gun in it. So now he's free. He's not shackled up. A lot of times when these people escape, they might have their shackles. They might have prison clothes on. Nope. He's in somebody's house. He can get fresh clothes. He's got a gun. And now he's out on the run. So what does he do? So shortly after this, the people that owned the home, after 3 days, because I told you guys it was an empty house, but somebody lived there. After 3 days, they come back in to check on the house. So the daughter of the owner and her husband come to check on the house. And what Mosley does is he ties up the men and he the women and then he leaves. And so then after that, he goes on another crime spree and he kidnaps another mother and child, but he holds them hostage for 2 hours and then lets them go. The women were completely unharmed. After this, he basically turns himself in and he goes back to jail. And he actually was part of one of the biggest prison riots of all time. It was the Attica Uprising, where 43 people died, which includes the correctional officers and prisoners. This was a huge, huge, huge riot. So he lives his life out in jail up until he was up for parole. And this was really fucking weird. What Winston said in his parole hearing was... He literally said his excuse for Kitty was sometimes people die when they get mugged, but the victim only has to endure the crime for an hour or two, whereas the perpetrator has to endure the punishment for the rest of their life. That's what he said during his parole. That's the kind of shit that makes me wonder, is this guy dumb, stupid, or dumb, or is he just saying shit for shock value? Of course, his parole was denied, and he spent the rest of his life in jail until he died pretty recently in 2016. You know, just so you can picture it, you know those like motels that have like 2 rows, like an upper level and lower, and it's just all the doors lined up? Imagine being there and screaming, yelling for help. You would think that with all those doors and occupied rooms that somebody would hear you. And so like, I just can't imagine like what was going through Kitty's head when she's screaming and crying and nobody's helping.